A hail of bullets sliced through the air that dark night. Victor Schmidt and Miguel Schneider barely had time to process what was happening when the enemy ambush erupted around them. They were 12 men on an espionage mission, stealthily advancing through the besieged territory, when suddenly they found themselves surrounded. Gunfire from all directions, explosions, frantic screams from their comrades. Chaos descended in the blink of an eye. Victor felt his heart pounding in his chest as he sought cover behind a semi-destroyed wall. His rifle hung helplessly in his trembling hands. Beside him, Miguel panted wide-eyed in sheer terror. There was nowhere to run. They were completely exposed to enemy fire. Desperate, Victor shouted orders for retreat, knowing they had to escape as quickly as possible. The group began scattering in retreat, sprinting through the rubble. That's when a grenade landed right beside them, just a few meters away. Victor shoved Miguel and dove to the other side, feeling the scorching heat of the explosion. When the smoke cleared, Victor realized with anguish that the rest of the group was gone. The ambush had separated them from the others, leaving them completely isolated in the middle of enemy territory. Their mission, their team, their purpose, all gone in the blink of an eye. Now, they were just two men stranded behind enemy lines, at the mercy of a grim fate. Victor looked around, panting. The street was nothing but smoldering rubble, destroyed buildings and bodies on the ground. A few meters away, Miguel was also getting up, staggering. Their eyes met, filled with apprehension. They were alone now, completely alone. The night crept on slowly, bringing with it an unsettling silence. The two soldiers were sheltered in a partially destroyed building, trying to recover from the ambush that had left them isolated. The cold began to bite, and the only thing keeping them alert was the constant sense of imminent danger. That's when Victor noticed something moving among the rubble. He raised his rifle, his eyes fixed on the shadow approaching. Miguel beside him did the same. For a moment, the sound of light footsteps echoed in the stillness. When the figure finally emerged from the darkness, both soldiers were taken aback. It was a dog. The animal was medium-sized, thin, and dirty, its fur matted and ribs visible under its skin. It observed them from a distance, hesitant, as if trying to decide whether the soldiers were a threat or a potential lifeline. Its eyes, glowing faintly under the moonlight, conveyed a mix of fear and curiosity. Victor lowered his rifle slowly, careful not to scare the animal. "Where did you come from?" he murmured, more to himself than to the dog. Miguel remained still, watching the scene cautiously. The dog took a step forward, then another, but stopped a few meters away. Clearly starving, it didn't come closer. Victor and Miguel exchanged a quick glance, both understanding what needed to be done. Without hesitation, Victor pulled the last piece of food from his backpack, a small portion of compacted rations. It was all they had left, but he knew the dog needed it more than they did at that moment. He extended his hand, offering the food. The dog hesitated, its eyes darting between Victor and the food. Finally, hunger won. Slowly it approached, carefully took the food, and retreated, chewing eagerly. Miguel opened his water bottle, took a small sip, and passed it to Victor. Then, they placed the bottle on the ground, allowing the dog to drink the rest. The animal lapped up the water quickly, as if afraid it would vanish at any moment. For a few minutes, the three remained silent. Victor and Miguel watched the dog as it finished eating and drinking. When it finally raised its head, the animal seemed different. Its eyes, once wary, now conveyed something closer to trust. The dog took a few steps toward the soldiers and sat down beside them, as if deciding it was now part of their small group. Victor glanced at Miguel, who shrugged as if to say, "Why not?" "Well, looks like we have a new companion," Victor said with a faint smile. The dog didn't make a sound, but its presence seemed to bring a strange comfort to the two soldiers. It stayed close, alert to any noise or movement, as if ready to protect those who had shared their last bit of food with it. The night's cold began to intensify, and Victor knew they needed to find shelter before complete darkness made them even more vulnerable. He and Miguel, now accompanied by the dog, searched the area until they found a partially destroyed building. Despite its precarious state, it seemed to be the only place where they could shield themselves from the biting wind and, with luck, avoid enemy patrols. "This is the best we've got," Victor said, as he helped Miguel climb through an opening in the wall. The dog followed them, agile, as if used to navigating ruins. Inside, the atmosphere was dark and silent. The walls were cracked and the ceiling threatened to collapse in places, but it was enough to offer some comfort. Victor checked his rifle's magazine. Only a few bullets left. Miguel did the same, letting out a heavy sigh at the sight of their limited ammunition. "You rest first," Victor said, sitting near the entrance. "I'll keep watch." Miguel didn't argue. Exhausted, his body gave in almost immediately to sleep. Victor, meanwhile, tried to stay alert, his eyes fixed on the darkness outside. But the strain of the day, the tension of the ambush, and physical exhaustion began to take their toll. Despite his efforts, his eyes closed, and he fell asleep without realizing it. Hours passed in silence until a subtle movement broke the stillness. The dog, lying near the soldiers, suddenly lifted its head. Its ears twitched, picking up something Victor and Miguel couldn't hear. It sniffed the air and stood up, muscles tensed. Outside, an enemy sniper positioned himself carefully, adjusting his aim to eliminate the sleeping soldiers. The dog, sensing the danger, acted instinctively. It ran to Victor, bit the hem of his pants and tugged forcefully, letting out a low growl. Victor woke with a start, confused by the animal's behavior. "What is it?" he murmured groggily. But as he looked at the dog, he realized something was wrong. Following the animal's fixed gaze, he spotted a distant glint, the reflection from a sniper scope. Victor's heart raced. He shoved Miguel, waking him quickly, and both dove behind a wall as the first shot rang out, striking the spot where they had been just seconds before. Victor's heart was still pounding as he pushed Miguel behind the wall. The sniper's first shot had been precise, but luckily it had missed them. Now the silence was almost as oppressive as the danger. Victor touched Miguel's shoulder, waking him abruptly, but quickly brought a finger to his lips, signaling for silence. He pointed to the distant glint he had noticed earlier. Miguel followed his gesture, squinting, and spotted the reflection of the sniper scope's lens. The sniper was positioned in a distant building, with a direct line of sight to their makeshift shelter. Any wrong move could be fatal. "We're trapped," Miguel whispered, barely audible. Victor nodded, but before he could respond, the dog, still alert, began sniffing the air and moving slowly toward the rubble. It stopped, looked back at the soldiers, and wagged its tail almost imperceptibly, as if beckoning them. Victor understood the message. "He wants us to follow him," he said in a whisper. Miguel hesitated for a moment, but there was no other option. Crawling along the ground, the two began following the dog, which seemed to choose each step carefully. It guided them through the rubble, avoiding open areas and keeping them out of the sniper's line of sight. Every movement was deliberate, and the absolute silence made everything even more tense. As they advanced, the sound of gunfire echoed in the distance. It wasn't clear whether the sniper was firing to intimidate them, or if he had detected some movement. Victor and Miguel froze with every shot, their muscles tense, bracing for the worst. But the dog, with its keen instincts, continued to lead the way, stopping only to sniff or observe the surroundings before moving forward. The tension was almost unbearable. Victor could feel sweat dripping down his face, mixing with the dust from the rubble. Miguel, right behind him, was breathing heavily, trying to stay calm. The dog, on the other hand, seemed unshaken, moving with a confidence the soldiers couldn't explain. After what felt like hours of crawling, the group finally reached a more protected area, where the rubble formed natural barriers blocking the sniper's line of sight. Victor stopped for a moment, pressing his back against a broken concrete wall, trying to catch his breath. After hours of tension and fleeing, Victor and Miguel finally found a place that seemed safe, at least for the time being. It was a small, partially intact concrete structure, hidden among the rubble. The space was cramped, but offered protection from potential enemy eyes. Victor sat on the ground, leaning his back against the cold wall and closing his eyes for a moment. He breathed deeply, trying to calm his nerves. Miguel, sitting beside him, did the same, while the dog lay next to them, as if it too needed rest. "This dog, he's not normal," said Miguel, breaking the silence. His voice was low, but it carried a tone of curiosity. Victor opened his eyes and looked at the animal, who was now licking its paws, seemingly oblivious to the conversation. I thought the same. He guided us like he knew exactly what he was doing. It's not just instinct. It's more than that. Miguel shook his head, thoughtful. It's like he understands the danger. He knew where to go, where to hide us. I've never seen anything like it. For a moment, both were silent, watching the dog. Victor, who had always been more skeptical about anything that couldn't be explained logically, felt something different as he looked at the animal. It wasn't just an unexpected companion. Somehow its presence seemed to bring a bit of balance amid the chaos they were facing. Do you think he was alone before he found us? Miguel asked, interrupting Victor's thoughts. Maybe, Victor replied, looking at the dog again. But now he's with us, and honestly I think we need him as much as he needs us. Miguel gave a slight smile, something rare in the past few hours. It's funny, in the middle of all this, he showed up. Like it was a sign. Victor didn't respond immediately. He reached out and gently petted the dog's head, and the animal lifted its eyes to him but didn't move. For the first time in a long while, Victor felt something close to hope. After the brief moment of rest, Victor and Miguel decided they couldn't stay there for long. The danger still lingered, and their only chance of survival was to try to return to the Allied camp. The problem was that they weren't sure of its exact location. The war had turned the territory into a maze of destruction, and any wrong move could lead them straight into the enemy's hands. We need to move before they find us, Victor said, adjusting his backpack. Miguel nodded in silent agreement, but it was the dog who took the initiative. It stood up, sniffed the air, and began walking slowly in a specific direction. He's guiding us again, Miguel commented, with a mix of surprise and trust. With no other option, the two followed the animal, which seemed to have an extraordinary sense of direction. With each step, the dog chose paths that avoided open and exposed areas, leading them through ruins and covered pathways. Victor began to notice that whenever the dog stopped to sniff or observe the surroundings, it was because something was wrong. On one of those occasions, it stopped them from going down a path that, upon closer inspection, was filled with landmines. The journey was arduous. The rain started to fall, turning the ground into a treacherous mud pit. Every step required extra effort, and the cold began to seep into their bones. Despite this, the dog pressed on, as if immune to the hardships. Victor and Miguel, on the other hand, struggled to keep pace. In addition to the hostile weather, there was the constant threat of enemy patrols. At one point, while crossing an open field, the dog stopped abruptly and began to growl softly. Victor immediately signaled for Miguel to crouch down. In the distance, they could hear the sound of vehicles and voices. They hid behind a pile of rubble while the dog remained motionless, attentive to every sound. When the danger passed, the animal resumed moving, leading them down an alternate route. Victor and Miguel's trust in the dog grew with every obstacle overcome. It was as if the dog had an infallible instinct, an almost supernatural ability to avoid danger. The day dragged on, and the fatigue began to take its toll. Victor felt his muscles aching, and Miguel could hardly hide his physical exhaustion. But the dog, tireless, continued to lead them, stopping only to rest briefly or sniff the surroundings. Finally, after what seemed like endless days, Victor spotted something in the distance. He stopped, squinting to make sure. Among the trees and rubble, a familiar structure began to emerge. It was the Allied camp. "We're close," Victor said, with a tone of relief. Miguel looked at the dog, who was now wagging its tail, as if it knew its mission was almost complete. "He brought us here," Miguel said with a tired smile. Victor smiled faintly, feeling a deep gratitude for the animal that somehow had become more than just a guide. It was a symbol of survival, a companion that had helped them through the worst. Exhausted, covered in mud, and with their bodies marked by the wear and tear of the long journey, Victor and Miguel finally crossed into the perimeter of the Allied camp. The sound of familiar voices and the movement of soldiers patrolling the area brought an immediate sense of relief. As soon as they were spotted, a group of comrades rushed toward them, expressing surprise and relief. "We thought you didn't make it," exclaimed one of the soldiers helping Miguel, who could barely stand. Victor, though equally exhausted, remained upright, giving a small nod to his comrades. "It was close," Victor replied, his voice hoarse. The dog, always by their side, remained still, observing everything attentively. Its presence soon caught the attention of the other soldiers, who began commenting on the animal. "Where did this dog come from?" one of them asked, intrigued. "He found us in the middle of the chaos," explained Miguel with a tired smile. "And honestly, I think he saved our lives." While the soldiers helped Victor and Miguel get settled, the dog stayed close, as if knowing its mission wasn't over yet. It seemed oblivious to the activity around it, but its watchful eyes took in every detail. Shortly afterward, a high-ranking officer, identified by the insignia on his uniform, approached. He was a man with a serious expression and an analytical gaze. Upon noticing the dog, he stopped abruptly, furrowing his brow. "This dog, where did you find him?" the officer asked, his tone a mix of curiosity and concern. Victor briefly explained how the animal had found and guided them during their escape. The officer listened carefully, but his expression grew even more serious. "I need to confirm something," he said, kneeling to examine the dog more closely. He inspected the animal carefully, searching for something around its neck. After a few seconds, he found what appeared to be a small device hidden under its fur. "This is exactly what I feared," said the officer, standing up. "This dog is part of an intelligence program from the enemy. They train animals to locate and protect soldiers in the field." The revelation hit like a bombshell. Victor and Miguel exchanged incredulous looks, struggling to process the information. "You're saying he belongs to the enemy?" Miguel asked, his voice laden with disbelief. "Yes," the officer confirmed, "but from what you've described, it seems he acted against his own training. It's rare, but sometimes these animals form bonds with those who save or protect them." A heavy silence filled the group. Victor looked at the dog, who was now sitting, staring at him with eyes that seemed to understand far more than an ordinary animal should. The night enveloped the camp in a heavy silence, broken only by the crackling of the campfire and the distant sounds of the forest. Victor and Miguel sat side by side, exhausted yet alert. The journey had ended, but the questions they carried seemed heavier than ever. The dog, who had been central to their survival, lay close to them. Its body rested, but its posture remained alert, as if ready to act at any moment. Victor watched the animal, trying to understand what had driven it to act the way it did. It wasn't just a dog trained by the enemy. There was something more. "Do you think it knew what it was doing?" Miguel asked, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, almost hesitant. Victor didn't answer immediately. He looked at the dog, which now stared back at him. That gaze wasn't empty, nor driven only by instinct. There was something there, a depth Victor couldn't explain. It was as if the animal understood more than either of them could imagine. "I don't know if it was instinct or something more," Victor said finally. "But I think it knew from the start." Miguel furrowed his brow, intrigued, but didn't press further. The silence settled again as they both reflected on what they had lived through. The dog closed its eyes, its calm breathing contrasting with the weight of the doubts that hung in the air. The campfire's flame illuminated the tired faces of the two soldiers, while the animal remained by their side, as a presence that, in some way, seemed larger than the moment. The story didn't end with answers, but with the certainty that, amidst the chaos, something inexplicable had guided their steps.